Previously on Alaska Cabin Adventures. I'm building this 8x12 cabin on a trailer that I can tow around with me to all the various adventures that I do across the state of Alaska. This is the first time that I've ever built something like this, and in the first episode I had to overcome a lot of obstacles and I wasn't anticipating. After getting the walls up, I was able to get a tarp on this because I knew that rain was coming. Little did I know a lot of rain was coming, and wind too. And that rain and wind worked itself up underneath the tarp and into the cabin, soaking my newly built subfloor, which caused it to mold. And I'm talking a lot of mold, and black mold too, not the kind that you want to see. In a total panic and pouring rain, I went out and staked the tarp out the best I could, added some 2x4s to the ridge beam to give more pitch to the tarp, and started spraying bleach on all the mold that I could see. I also added a couple of box fans to try to get some air circulating to try to dry this stuff out and stop the growth of the mold. When the rain finally stopped, I looked at the weather and saw that I only had a 3-day window before the rain was going to come back. I knew I absolutely had to get a roof on this over the next 3 days before the weather rolled in and ruin my project any more than I'd already had. But I had a lot to do. I needed to do Tyvek, siding, roof framing, sheeting, and finally some kind of protective waterproof coat over the top of it before I could relax a little bit and know that my structure was safe. Because once this tarp came off, it's a race against the elements. Underneath the bottom plates of my walls, you could see that things are still pretty wet. This was not an encouraging sign for the rest of the cabin. This is going to be one of those days. In all the previous cabin builds that I've done, I would put some kind of sheeting like OSB or plywood directly onto the studs, then wrap that with Tyvek, followed by some kind of siding, usually a rough cut spruce lap siding. But in this one I decided to go with the Tyvek directly to the studs for a couple of reasons. The first and most important is that I needed to save weight, so I didn't want to put down sheeting, some kind of Tyvek, and then have to cover that entire thing up with siding. That would be way too much weight for this tiny trailer. So instead I'm starting with the house wrap and then putting T111 directly on the top of that, which will not only be structural, but it'll add a nice finished product to the outside. I do have a couple of tricks up my sleeve for making this thing look cabin-esque too. You'll see later on. It wasn't long before I ran into my first roadblock. I realized I had totally forgotten to nail in this sill plate when I was framing out the walls.
Oh no.
Oh well, just have to get creative.
Shoot. Right.
This side was trickier because the framing wouldn't allow me to get my drill in there, so I had to come in from the pocket. Typically, you'd want to use overlapping top plates to tie your walls together, but in this build, my top plates have to extend out over the porch to have some overhang, so instead I used these mending plates to make sure that they weren't going anywhere. Putting up the sheeting on your walls by yourself is never an easy task, but it can be done on a normal cabin by adding some kind of toe board underneath. You measure out exactly how low you want your plywood to sit, add some kind of 2x4, and then you can rest the plywood on the 2x4 while you nail in the sheeting. But unlike a normal cabin, there's no wood framing under here. It's just the metal frame of the trailer, so I had nothing to add that toe board to. So instead I put a toe board up on the top to make sure that the sheeting at least couldn't go higher than it needed to. But this still didn't solve the problem of having something hold the plywood up while I nailed it in. So instead I called on the old reinforcements and had my wife come out and give me a hand.
Got it.
That's a miss. You want to see if I missed to the left or the right?
You're on the window, so you actually didn't hit close to anything.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. Okie doke, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, we don't have that board up there.
Out of pure laziness, I decided not to add the stop board to this last section of plywood. That came back to bite me later on. Since I normally put my Tyvek on top of my sheeting, I've always been able to cut out my window openings without any problem. But I realized that if I put the Tyvek down first and then cut out these window openings, it's going to rip up all that Tyvek that I'd spent all that time to fold so nicely into the sides of the windows. It's not a big deal. I'll go back in later with Grace Ice and Water Shield tape to make sure that they're waterproof. But next time, I think I'll just cut my sheeting out before I put it up. Like I said earlier, not putting that stop board at the top of the wall kind of cost me a few minutes here. I realized that the sheeting was sticking up just enough that it was going to interfere with the bird's mouth of my rafter tails, so I went ahead and trimmed it off. One of the things that I love about building is that there's so many different ways to do it, and everyone has their own methods that work for them. I learn an incredible amount of things every project I do, and even from one wall to the next, I'll find better ways of doing things. So for the first wall, I measured and cut every single piece of plywood individually. For the second wall, I realized they're all the same length, so I just gang cut them. I also decided I'd mark the 24-inch on center line where the stud was going to be before I put it up, instead of having to measure and wrestle with the chalk line like I did on the last wall. I'll admit I was pretty disappointed with the progress I made in one day. I only had 2 days left to get this roof done, and that rain was on its way. But lucky for me, my good buddy Forrest was willing to come over and help me get this roof put on before the rain hit. If you guys don't know Forrest, he's the one who helps me make all the music for the channel. It's all original, we write and record most of it at the cabin, and it's for sale on my website at alaskacabinadventures.com. I can't thank him enough for the awesome contributions he makes to this channel. It really wouldn't be the same without him.
Nice and flush.
Yep, it's in there.
Okay, right there.
Now that I finally had all the walls done, I could get started on the roof. And let me tell you what, cutting rafters is not an easy thing. If you're off with your calculations by just one little thing that you didn't consider, all of a sudden none of the rafters want to fit at all, and it turns into a big nightmare and a lot of wasted 2x4s. I didn't film it because I got so frustrated, but I actually cut probably 7 or 8 rafters wrong before I finally got one that seemed like it wanted to fit. I realized what the problem was is that the ridge beam I had put up was the wrong height, so no matter how hard I tried to make a 612 pitch rafter, it wasn't going to fit at the top of that ridge beam. Finally, I pulled that ridge beam down, built new supports for it, and put it back up. I do regret not filming that because I really wanted to show you guys the struggles someone like me has while building a cabin. But after all, I was in a serious time crunch, so I just put the camera down and got it done. A big revelation I had was finding these brackets that will help you hang your rafters from the ridge beam. They're structural and they really make it easy for putting it up there. That way you don't have to try to hold it in the exact right spot while you nail it in with the nail gun. And they'll accommodate almost any angle that you choose to cut your rafters at. Obviously, wind is going to be a huge factor with this build. I can expect 100-mile-an-hour winds consistently with this cabin, considering that it's going to be going down the road at 60 miles an hour, plus whatever wind is coming at it. So I wanted to make sure that the other end of the rafters were really well anchored into the walls. I use these 6-inch long Timberlock lag screws through the butt of every single rafter. That goes through the rafter and through both the top and bottom wall plates. That way the roof can't rip off the walls unless it takes the walls with it. Let's see here. I know it's supposed to be 73 1/4, but in fact it is 72 1/4. Yeah, that's the problem. By the time I was getting close to finish with these rafters, I looked up and noticed that the blue skies were gone and that the leaves were starting to blow in the wind. I was totally exhausted from building for the last 3 days straight, but I knew I had to get this done and I knew I was running out of time, so I kept at it. For the last couple rafters, I wasn't able to use the same hangers that I was using on the other ones, so instead I just nailed them to the ridge board, which I think will be fine for these last couple of rafters. If you notice, my rafter tails don't have any overhang on them. They're cut plumb with the walls. The reason for this is that in order to be street legal, this structure has to be under 8 foot 6 inches wide. The cabin's already 8 feet wide, and the sheeting takes up another inch. So I'm only left with 5 inches total, which means 2.5 inches on either side of the cabin for any kind of overhang. So instead of putting any overhang on the eaves, I might just have the sheet metal roofing overhang by a couple inches on either side to try to maximize that 8 foot 6 inches that I'm allowed.
Just my size. I'm gonna be able to stand up in the whole thing. It's gonna be fun.
When it was finally time to start putting the decking on the roof, 2 things happened. One, the first drop of rain hit my arm. The second was that my good friend Brandon just happened to be in the neighborhood and was willing to help me pound this thing out before the rain really started to pour. On a typical roof, you'd want to leave something called a ridge vent to make sure that the moisture that gets up into your ceiling has a place to escape. You'd leave your eaves open and about an inch gap underneath your insulation to make sure that the air could be pulled from the eaves up to the ridge and escape out through the ridge vents. That way you don't get moisture in your ceiling, causing mold and rot and different things like that. But this little cabin on wheels, you can't do that. You have to close up all the possible entryways into the roof so that wind doesn't blow snow and rain up into your roof from the eaves and the ridge vent. So I decided to put Grace Ice and Water Shield over the entire roof and even overlap the edges so that way it couldn't get up in between the crevices between the roof and the walls. And I'll tell you what, it wasn't a second too soon.
Right on. Thanks, dude. Sure. Yes. All right. 100%.
I can't tell you just how relieved I felt to have the roof on right in the nick of time for this rainstorm. Now I can take my time getting things finished without having to worry about impending weather ruining everything I've worked for. I also really can't tell you how thankful I am for the people in my life who are willing to come out and help me out. Because at the end of the day, a cabin is just a thing. It's just a box made out of wood. But the memories that you make with the people that you build it with are the things that are truly valuable and last a lifetime. Thanks so much for watching Alaska Cabin Adventures. Don't forget to check out my website. You can get the music, merch, or donate to the channel if you're feeling generous. And I'll see you guys on the next episode.